Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in today's video we'll be talking about one of the most important political philosophers that every political scientist or every CSS aspirant must know, and he is Montesquieu. So Montesquieu is known as a very important political philosopher because he kind of propagated the idea of separation of power, and he explained the role of different organs of the government. And it's very important to have an idea of the early life of any political philosopher. So in this way we see that Montesquieu had a classical training in terms of his education in humanities and law, and he was basically trained to be a legal scholar and judge, and his intellect was something that was never confined to the courtroom. In fact, he was someone who was very much interested into the matters of public life. In fact, he was much interested into how people perceived law, legal matters, history, politics, and he had a very vast experience of traveling across Europe. So all these things were something that kind of shaped his political philosophy and motivated him to talk about things in a more organized manner, which was not done before. So talking about his political philosophy, the first point that is associated with Montesquieu is his idea of the separation of power. Separation of power is considered as a very integral part of political science today. When we discuss political systems, the idea of separation of power is considered institutional in defining the roles of different organs of the government. And Montesquieu is known for promoting this idea, as he divided the government power into three branches: the legislative, executive, and judiciary. He believed that when all powers are concentrated in a single person or body, tyranny is inevitable. So his idea of promoting the idea of separation of power was to reduce authoritarianism and tyranny. In fact, he says that when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, there can be no liberty. He basically said that the legislature is supposed to do different tasks, which is making laws. Executive is used to execute them, which means implementation is their major responsibility. And judiciary is there to strike a balance between the legislation and the execution. At the same time, judiciary is also responsible for interpreting the constitution. And that is why we see that his idea is something that is associated with modern day egalitarianism and democracy, and that is why we see its bits and pieces in US's constitution. So the second point that he talked about was checks and balances. Montesquieu emphasized that the branches of the government must limit each other to maintain political liberty. If one branch becomes dominant, it endangers freedom. So he says that it is not enough to divide powers, they must be in tension with each other. So this can be explained in a way that the purpose of the separation of power is to departmentalize the responsibility of legislature, executive, and judiciary in such a way that not only is the balance of power maintained, but at the same time a system of regulated checks and balances also ensured. Because when every a department is focusing on its task, the principle of non-interference is practiced, but at the same time, the principle of non-interference demands a system of checks and balances, which can only be maintained when a system of separation of power is maintained. Because if there are merging powers within two or three bodies of government, they can try to manipulate the interest of the greater the greater interest, basically. So that is why checks and balances and separation of power are considered as two very important aspects of Montesquieu's political philosophy. And then we can talk about classification of governments that was put forth by Montesquieu. Montesquieu divided political system into three ideal types, each governed by a unique principle. The first one was republic, monarchy, and then this last one was despotism. So he said that republic was something that was guided by virtue, monarchy was guided by honor, and despotism was guided by fear. And he said that, these ideal types of governments can survive only if its principle is sustained. If he said each kind of government has its own principle. If these principles are sustained, only then these governments can survive. A republic without virtue becomes corrupt. A monarchy without honor becomes arbitrary, and the despotism always teeters on the edge of chaos. So this is very important, as this provided a very organized framework for the classification of government. After Aristotle, if someone focused on the classification of government in a very organized manner, it was Montesquieu. And then every philosopher has, a book associated with him. And in Montesquieu's case, his book, The Spirit of Laws, is known as one of his, is known as his magnum opus. So his book was not merely a political treatise, but it was a comparative study of laws, institutions, and societies across civilizations, as Montesquieu argued that laws must be adapted to the people for whom they are made. So here the word adapted is used and not adopted. So when you adapt to situations or adapt to a certain thing, it means that you are focusing on an evolving nature of things. And that is what Montesquieu focused on. He studied ancient Rome, contemporary France, Islamic empires, Asian monarchies, and English constitution. And his major purpose was not to pass a judgment, but to understand the conditions under which laws succeed or fail. And then he also talked about some very different point of views. For example, he talked about the climate theory. Now, climate theory was something that in Muslim political thought is discussed by Al-Farabi. And in Western political thought, Montesquieu discusses it. He has a rather controversial point of view regarding it, where he says that climate influences culture and temperament and political institutions. He believed people in colder climates were more vigorous and industrious, while those in warmer climates were more passive. And of course, it does make some sense, as we can relate to it at an individual level when we are living in, cool environments, or when there is winter in our part of the world. We tend to be more calm, composed, and things. We are able to process things in a much better way. But when there are summers, as they are, right now, there are many things happening around us, and we are all the time juggling between things. We are all the time very angry, anxious, and irritated. So yes, at an individual level it might make some sense, but at an institutional level it's a very big thing. It's a very big comment to be passed. But of course it was his idea, it was his findings, so we need to discuss it that way. And then he also talked about liberty as the absence of arbitrary power. Now, liberty was something that he considered very important, but liberty for him was something that was needed to be sanctioned by departmentalization, by accountability in terms of checks and balances, right? For example, he gives each government institution the liberty to do whatever it wants to do, but by being in the ambit of the law. So Montesquieu defined liberty not as the license to do anything and everything, but as security under fair and predictable laws. In his words, liberty is the right to do what the law permits. So basically, liberty is something that is sanctioned by the law, which means when you're talking about law, you are institutionalizing the system of rights and duties, be it with the institutions or be it with the individuals. He believed freedom thrives not in anarchy, but in structured legal order, one where no one, not even the ruler, is above the law. So definitely that's a very great point. And then he also talked about opposition to absolutism. Montesquieu was a firm critic of absolute monarchy, especially the kind that had taken root in France under the Louis XIV. He believed that unchecked power leads to tyranny and oppression and must be restrained by institutions and civil society. So he does not justify absolute monarchy as Hobbes did. He did it through his social contract, right? Montesquieu is someone who believed that absolutism in any of its form cannot be justified, cannot be maintained in any society, because he was himself a victim of that political situation. We know that France later did go through a huge revolution, but before the revolution took place, there were successive leaders in France, there were successive monarchs in France who had deteriorated the situation of law and order in the country, and their interests were focused on absolute power for themselves. And then, of course, he also talked about judiciary as the guardian of rights. Montesquieu argued that the judiciary must be independent and separate from the legislature and executive. He said that this was the only way to protect individuals from abuse of power. Judges should be the mouthpiece of the law, not its authors or enforcers. So when we talked about the separation of power and checks and balances, that is where I mentioned that the major purpose of judiciary is to interpret the law. Judiciary needs to be in its ambit. In modern day phenomena, we can see it in the reference of judicial activism, where it is criticized highly in democracies and in first world countries. Of course, you can make a relation out of it with respect to the contemporary issues in Pakistan or somewhere else in the world. But at the same time, there needs to be a check and balance, basically. Whenever there's a check and balance, the system of accountability is ensured within the political institutions, and that is what democracy is all about. Otherwise, too many, you can say, the gray area in the system of law can lead to anarchy. Anarchy is not only about not having law, but anarchy is also about having too many laws where you do not know what to follow, what not to follow. So yeah. And then he also talked about influence on modern democracies. Montesquieu's impact can be seen in the American Constitution, especially in the Federalist Papers, where James Madison and others frequently cite him. If you have studied the American Constitution, or the Federalist Papers, you see that they openly cite Montesquieu, favoring his egalitarian ideas of separation of power and checks and balances within the system of a government, marking it as a great departure from the absolutism of monarchy and colonialism that existed in America under the British rule. So his ideas, of course, echo in parliamentary systems, constitutional courts, and civil liberties. And that is why we say that he is a very important political philosopher. But yeah, so of course there could be some points that you could disagree with, but at the same time we cannot disagree with the fact that he has been an instrumental force in the political development of the political systems that we see around us today. Okay, so now we'll be discussing about the criticism of Montesquieu's political philosophy. So the first one is about his climate theory. Now, Montesquieu's claim that climate affects people's character and political systems has been widely criticized for lacking scientific basis. It is because he suggested that people in colder climates are more industrious and courageous, while those in hot climates are more passive or even lazy. So this idea has been labeled deterministic, you can say racialized and Eurocentric. For example, in today's political and social scientists, in their writings of today's political and social scientists, we see that they reject climatic determinism as overly simplified and scientifically unfounded. This is something that is related to anthropology, where we see that when you associate climate with certain attitudes of people, you kind of just generalize the idea or the behaviors of the people, and you kind of justify that. So that of course doesn't make sense. And then there are inconsistencies in classification of governments. Montesquieu's classification of governments into republics, monarchies, and despotisms is incomplete and inconsistent. For example, the distinction between monarchy and despotism becomes blurry when both concentrate power in a single ruler. He also fails to acknowledge hybrid systems like constitutional monarchies and semi-authoritarian regimes. In monarchy and despotism, he says that power is in the hands of one person, but he kind of says that the difference is in what kind of virtue they hold or what kind of spirit they have. He says that one has the virtue of, one has the spirit of virtue, the other has the spirit of fear. So it's very abstract, right? So that doesn't make a lot of sense. And at the same time, he fails to acknowledge hybrid systems like constitutional monarchies and such stuff, which were very much present at the time when he was at his peak or in his political bloom. And of course, cultural relativism is something that we see is lacking in his political philosophy because he is too dependent on historical context. Cultural relativism is also lacking because he kind of does present a universal generalization on the basis of climate, but individualistic or political institutions or the way the political institutions could have a relative approach is not explained by him. For example, he says that the laws should be adapted to each society's customs, geography, and religion. While this contextualism was advanced for his time, it can also be interpreted as cultural relativism that avoids universal principles like human rights. This makes its philosophy less useful for criticizing unjust laws within a given society, especially authoritarian or theocratic regimes. For example, you could say that in Middle East, if the women are not given rights, so that is justified because it's according to their customs and rules. Okay, you could say, you could agree to that to some extent, but what if the femicide there is so common? What if women are being murdered in the name of honor every now and then? How can you justify that, as it happens in Afghanistan? For example, Afghanistan tries to justify the kind of attitude or the kind of laws and customs it has for women and children on the basis of its own cultural rules and regulations. But okay, for that point we can accept it. But then what about international law? What about human rights? What about the universal natural rights, liberty, freedom, egalitarian ideas? So that is where there is a debate that even exists today, that organizations like UN cannot do anything about it. So cultural relativism is okay, but to what extent are we going to let the culture be relative? Is it to an extent that the individuals are going to die, or is it to an extent that we keep a certain region or a certain country segregated for a very long time? That doesn't make sense, right? And then there's also a lack of normative clarity. So the criticism about this point is that Montesquieu often describes political systems rather than prescribing them. He analyzes what works under certain conditions, but he rarely takes a firm moral or philosophical stance on what ought to be done. So basically, he's more of a descriptive and an explanatory political philosopher rather than a suggestive and an assertive one. As a result, his work can be accused of political pragmatism, lacking a clear ethical foundation. This makes sense, right? So he also neglects the economic dimension. So Montesquieu considers factors like geography and religion a lot, and he paid little attention to economics as a driving force of political system. This is why Karl Marx and other materialist thinkers found Montesquieu's analysis insufficient. They argued that class, labor, and ownership of resources play a far greater role in shaping laws and state structures rather than Montesquieu's acknowledgement of geography or rules or religion only. And then he also had a very limited point of view of equality and democracy. He favored aristocratic republicanism, particularly the Roman model. His ideal republic was often elitist, relying on the virtue of the few, not the participation of the many. He was also skeptical of full democracy, fearing mob rule more than elite control. As such, his model of liberty leans more towards constitutional balance and egalitarian justice. So this is very important. When in modern day debate, we talk about the downside of democracy, right? Or why we cannot achieve democracy. What are the issues with democracy? So that is something that we see in Montesquieu's political philosophy, that his idea of equality in democracy is very limited. He explains separation of power. He explains balance of power. He explains accountability, but at the same time he's leaned towards aristocratic republicanism, which means he favors elite rule more than the widespread democratic system of institutions and individuals having all kinds of rights to speak and do whatever they want, because he knew that democracy did have a downside. He did realize that democracy is good, but democracy needs to be managed. Democracy cannot be just presented to people in its true form, because neither can the people nor can the systems themselves sustain that. And that is why we also know that to have a very strong democracy, we need to have a very educated manpower. We need to have a very educated citizenry that is very much aware of their rights. So that is why his political system, or the kind of system that he propagates, even though he does not clearly and explicitly promote it, is aristocratic republicanism, where he wants a merge of political institutions doing their work, but at the same time a few people being in control of what is happening. So to conclude, we can say that Montesquieu's insights did transform political science, but they were not perfect. From his outdated climate theories to his elitist leanings, his work reflects both brilliance and limitations of Enlightenment thought. Understanding these criticisms help us appreciate not only what Montesquieu got right, but also where political philosophy had to evolve. So, of course, this is a part of, a journey, a part of every political philosopher's life, where there is a lot of criticism that is mounted towards them, but it is important as it helps people of the contemporary age learn better things. So this was the video for today. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.